You're listening to a Beyond the Box bonus.
The race to net zero is on. And one of the trickiest sectors to decarbonise is the chemicals industry. But it's not impossible. Find out more in this special bonus episode of Beyond the Box, brought to you in partnership with FT Longitude.
The chemical industry has a huge role to play in a sustainable future. Around 96% of all manufactured goods depend on chemical manufacturers, producers, and distributors in some way. From fertilizers to consumer goods, this crucial sector creates the very world we live in. It's also a major contributor to climate change. Each year, the industry emits around 2 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's roughly 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And Scope 3 emissions, which are the hardest to track, account for more than 70% of that total. It's clear that radical changes are needed in this carbon-intensive industry.
The chemical industry is part of the solution going forward. It may be seen as a polluter of the past, but for us it's really key to the future of sustainability.
I think the awareness is definitely there. Could it go faster? Yes, is the answer. But things are moving.
Momentum is building as chemical companies search for new paths to reduce their logistics and supply chain emission. But there's no denying the road ahead is long.
The thing with decarbonization is that there is no magic bullet. It's not like there's one thing you can do and then you're 80% done. It's a long, hard grind of one piece after the other.
So how can the chemical industry tackle emissions in its supply chain and logistics? I'm Sean Kern, Strategy Director at FT Longitude. In this audio feature, I'll be exploring how the chemical industry is facing its biggest challenge yet: the pivot to a sustainable future. For the chemical industry, there are many possible paths to decarbonisation, including biomass, recycling, and carbon capture and storage. Many companies reach first for the lower-hanging fruit, such as Scope 1 and 2 emissions. These are the emissions made by a company or as a consequence of its activities. But as the climate crisis continues, more attention is turning to Scope 3 emissions, those produced indirectly by companies' up and downstream value chain. This is bringing the chemical supply chain into sharp focus.
If you look at the greenhouse gas emissions in total, globally, almost half of it comes from supply chains.
Here's Vereecke, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management at the Vlerick Business School in Belgium.
So if half of the greenhouse gas emissions come from supply chains, about 1/3 of that comes from transportation. Logistics is more than just transportation, but you could argue that about 1/6 of the global emissions might come, and it's a rough number that I'm giving you here, but might come from transportation and by extension from logistics. So it's huge, and there's a lot of potential for improvement.
And the good thing about transportation emissions is that you can actually do something about it. There are actually solutions available in the market. So it's a good place to get started.
Meet Morten Christiansen, Senior Vice President and Head of Decarbonisation at Danish logistics service provider Maersk.
It's a very complex business, chemical industries, and typically you have very long-lived assets, and many are dependent on each other. So I would say it is probably one of the more complex sectors to decarbonize. But that, of course, shouldn't hold us back. And interestingly, some of the new fuels that we are seeing in shipping, so methanol and ammonia, well, they are actually chemicals. So actually, many of the chemical companies know these molecules very well, and some even produce them in large quantities.
Rapid advances in electric vehicle technology open another window of opportunity for low-carbon transportation.
So battery electric trucks, for example, there we clearly see a pathway towards cost parity in a foreseeable future, whether it's 3, 5 or 7 years. Technology is hard to predict, but we clearly see a pathway to cost parity, at least in principle. There's a lot of buts and ifs because it requires charging capacity, it requires grid capacity, it requires availability of trucks and so on. But if you just look at sort of the raw financials of battery cost and battery performance, then there is a clear pathway to cost parity in for example, trucking. For deep sea shipping, certainly. It'll take a few years before we can sail a ship from Asia to the US or Europe on batteries. But even for short sea, it may actually be an attractive option in a not too distant future. I think technology will over time solve the problem for us. If history is any teacher, and I guess it is, then that is for sure. It's a matter of time. But it may take a while for some of the more hard to abate sectors.
On this point, Tim Doggett agrees, and he should know. As CEO of the Chemical Business Association, Tim has more than 30 years' experience in supply chain management and logistics. During this time, he has witnessed the growing push for sustainability in the chemical industry.
And there has been great progress in Scope 1, which are much easier to measure and also directly influence. Scope 2 and Scope 3 much more challenging, predominantly indirect emissions, and it's much less visible, less transparent, and they're harder to measure. However, there is much time and investment that's gone into creating tools and looking at that. The Chemical Business Association was founded all the way back in 1923, so just over 100 years ago. We're a UK trade association representing the chemical supply chain. Our membership today is made up of the chemical supply chain, which includes everybody from chemical manufacturers to distributors, importers, exporters, also logistics companies, and the whole sector really that makes up the chemical supply chain, which supports the chemical industry.
As customers continue pressing the chemical industry to justify its carbon footprint, the entire supply chain is coming under heavy scrutiny. So where and how should companies begin the transition?
Companies knowing their supply chain and knowing it thoroughly. So many businesses perhaps are only aware of the first level or tier 1 logistics or supply chain. So they think they're buying from a supplier based in Europe, but actually their supplier is sourcing it from Asia. And then potentially those raw materials have made several journeys in the manufacturing process before it even became a finished product. So one of the things that businesses really need to do is to analyse their supply chain and look where the products are really coming from. And that's also very important in terms of cost, but also secure supply chains. As supply chains have become more and more extended, then they become more and more vulnerable.
With so much potential for change across the entire chemical ecosystem, leaders in the industry are carefully considering the challenges and opportunities ahead. Understanding the supply chain is the first step. The next is to optimize it. Globalization has made supply chains and logistics incredibly complex, thanks in part to increasingly efficient and well-connected transport networks. But there's still room for improvement, particularly in the chemical industry, which involves many stages of manufacturing and distribution. How, then, can the sector reduce emissions in its supply chain? One way would be to optimize logistics. For example, better planning shipments means reducing the miles traveled and the number of trucks, ships, or trains needed.
Now, both aspects, less transportation, less distance being traveled, means less energy being consumed, means less emissions being generated, but it also means less cost because you use less energy for the transportation. So the cost of your transportation will go down. If I can use my assets better, my trucks, my trains, my boats, then it means I need less assets in the end. I need less trains, I need less trucks. So I'll have to invest less in renewing my asset base, which is a financial aspect. It means on your balance sheet, you can do the same revenue with less assets. So both ways mean in the end that your financial performance will go up.
In some cases, optimization could be a simple matter of questioning existing processes. Does this shipment really need to go by air, for example? Or can it be sent by sea? What about a combination of transport modes? And is there any flexibility in the timings and transit requirements? Where possible, some companies are looking to group their shipments for greater efficiency. Here's Tim Doggett again.
It's in everybody's interest to be more efficient and to consolidate and to maximise payloads. Rather than handing it out to various carriers, you try and utilise one who could then consolidate the cargo and just be much more efficient. So, for example, it could be one vehicle collecting it that then goes into multiple supply chains and modes of transport rather than lots of vehicles making the collection.
It's also prompting new approaches to partnerships, as Morten explains.
Everybody just sits there and try and pass the cost monkey on to the next person. We are not getting anywhere. The key here is that we actually can partner up for longer term and actually make long-term agreements with each other so that we can share the risk. And you should make those agreements in a way that the risk is carried by those who are most capable of actually handling the risk. If what we are actually also trying to do with some of our customers is to actually bring them together and compare transport patterns and see, are there areas where we can actually create some critical mass by bundling the demand from this customer, that customer, and that customer? Because then all of a sudden, you actually have something that you can take to a charging infrastructure developer or a truck owner and say, hey, would you be willing to invest in a 5-year commitment on volumes? We may not take all the risk, but if you can shoulder, 50 to 60% of the risk, all other things equal, there's a lot higher likelihood that this is going to materialize.
That said, in order to get there, you may have to do some investments. You will have to invest in a better planning system. You will have to invest in, let's share the data, let's connect to these platforms, let's work in a different way. Now, those investments are kind of a barrier at the same time. So in the end, it comes down to what is my return on my investments? And that requires a long-term view on this. And what I do see is that despite the fact that in the longer term, you could expect some cost reductions from your improvement of your ecological footprint, in the short term, your cost might go up. And I do see that hesitation pretty often from companies. There's this willingness to invest, but then when it really comes to doing it, the cost pressure might prevail.
And prevail it does. For procurement teams in particular, the push to go green is often overlooked in the face of shorter-term incentives such as cost reduction. The result? Companies that continue to prioritize supply chain and logistics partners that don't share the same sustainability goals or values. As Anne explains.
It's important for procurement to have a balanced set of objectives that they should meet. And this is not a new issue. Now, why is it then that when push comes to shove, they often just look at cost, for example? To some extent, it has to do with how are they incentivized? To what extent is this whole sustainability move should come from the top? It should be a strategic priority for the company, which it is for many companies, at least in what they say. But if it's truly a strategic priority, then it means it's rippled down in all layers of the organization and in all functions, including the procurement function. So the question then is it in the targets of the procurement people to go for the best supply from an ecological perspective? And how do you get it in their targets? Is their bonus based on, to some extent, cleverly defined KPIs that relate to the ecological footprint of what they buy? And that, I think, is where we fall short still today.
So who should pay for the price of sustainability? Morten argues that consumers should be footing the bill in order to drive up demand and lower costs in the long run.
I think now I speak personally, but I actually think we as consumers should pay for that because it's actually our consumption at the end of the day. And certainly us who live here in Europe and the US, that we have been consuming heavily for many, many years, we have created the problem through our consumption. If you want green products and you have demand and you're willing to pay, they will come. That's how business works. It boils down to creating demand. Demand in the market will get the ball rolling. I think collaboration across the different value chains are absolutely essential to get to where we want to go on the decarbonization. Technologies are there for most of our sectors. Very, very few actually are left where you can't see a scalable pathway.
With so many forces driving the chemical industry to tackle its Scope 3 emissions, organizations are setting their sights on collaborative approaches to cut their carbon footprint.
And I think actually a good example from our industry was this December at the COP28 in Dubai, where you actually saw 5 shipping CEOs who normally are fierce competitors. They actually got up together and said, listen, for this topic about decarbonizing our industry, we want to stand together. We want to send a clear message that it can entirely be done, and here's what it takes. So I think that kind of industry collaboration on there are just some topics that transcends competition and the normal dynamics of your industry, right? And I think this is one of them. And really, truly, no one can do this by themselves. It's just impossible.
In the chemical supply chain, it is a very collaborative environment already. Many of these businesses work incredibly closely together and have great relationships. There's a lot of SMEs, a lot of family-owned businesses, and they really do work together. A good example, easy example to give you is during the pandemic, when the chemical industry came together at really short notice and came up with hand sanitizer. It changed and did lots of things to make that possible. So there is already a lot of collaboration. And also, let's not forget that chemical companies consist of people as well. And I don't know anybody that's got a wish to create more emissions or to be less efficient or to be more dangerous. So there's a collective desire amongst everybody to work towards that end.
But collaboration between competitors is often easier said than done, particularly when it comes to sharing intellectual property or commercially sensitive information. Here's Anne to explain.
Horizontal and vertical collaborations are important. Horizontal collaboration, meaning between companies typically that are competitors of each other, has its own challenges. Collaboration requires trust, so collaborating with your competitor is not an obvious thing. But there's also laws going against collaboration with competitors. What I would argue is more important even than the horizontal collaboration is the vertical collaboration. If I take a supply chain perspective, meaning that we go from the raw material to the final consumer, if you simply take that perspective, I think it's pretty obvious that if you could join forces in that supply chain with all partners involved, now that's ideal, of course, you will never be able to join forces with all partners involved, there's a lot you can accomplish. So for me, the vertical collaboration in the supply chain is tremendously important to consider, to think about improving the ecological footprint of the supply chain.
Trust is also crucial where data is concerned, especially with the growing promise of analytics to unlock new paths to decarbonisation. It's an issue Maersk encounters often with its customers.
Obviously, sharing data is always a sensitive topic. Sharing it with your competitor is, it's beyond sensitive, right? And often at times actually illegal for very good reasons. I think therefore it's important to have someone in there that can create some kind of trusted clearinghouse or whatever you can think about it. This has obviously also been a discussion topic in our dialogue with customers, but I think we managed to find a level of granularity of the data that the customers were willing to share. Just to get started, you don't need all the granularity of the data, but you do need some to get started. But we managed to find that balance. But you're absolutely right. It requires trust. Any real partnership requires trust. And certainly if you want to make a long-term partnership, most of the time you compete like crazy with your competitors.
How then might AI and other technology innovations prove groundbreaking on the road to net zero?
The transport network is generally already very efficient and highly optimized, but digital technologies really enable a step change in further improvements. And AI, I suppose, is only really limited by our own imaginations at the moment of what we can do with it and how we can best apply it. Tools like AI are enabling us already to really analyse that data, to find the data in the first place, and then to work out what we can do or best do with it.
I think that with the use of AI, simply from a perspective of understanding the supply chain and getting the data and knowing what the supply chain looks like, AI can help to improve that view and to make it much more fine-grained and make it much more real-time. In which country, with which partner am I doing business, or is someone that I'm doing business with, which will help to get a much better understanding of where are the scope 3 emissions the highest, where are they important more than anywhere else. And once you know that, you can start to improve on it. And then the second aspect is once you know where to improve, then you need advanced systems to optimize the supply chain, to bring flows together. And again, that is something that AI as an advanced analytical tool can help you to simulate, to create a digital twin of your supply chain, to then simulate with that digital twin, and then in the end to optimize the way you run your supply chain. So both ways, I think, is we only see the beginning of what could be a fascinating story, I think.
The chemical industry's road to net zero is paved with good intentions. But it's action that this carbon-intensive sector needs now more than anything.
I think we all have an obligation to do our utmost, and it is important to act now because the clock is ticking and the climate problem is a budgetary problem, right? I mean, there's only so much left we can emit before it goes terribly wrong, meaning that just postponing and waiting and let's see what happens 5 years from now, it's just not a responsible approach to take.
There's also a reality that as society, as the economy, and for sustainability, we need chemicals. And actually, the chemical industry is part of the solution going forward. It may be seen as a polluter of the past, but for us, it's really key to the future of sustainability, and that incorporates everything like emissions and alternatives and so on.
The sector's leaders, many of whom are alive to the challenges and opportunities of decarbonisation, are taking important steps to tackle logistics and supply chain emissions.
If we don't act now, I think future generations can actually fully blame us. So I think it's about time, and I think the time is now. We should all acknowledge how difficult it is. Again, the chemical sector is one of the more complex, but there's still a lot of things that you can do and that you should do. And I think we are seeing the first actions happening, and there are companies really trying to lead the way here, which is very encouraging. And that's how it starts, right? It starts with the leader, and then the others follow. Courageous leadership is probably the thing that we need the most right now, and that we are also seeing from some in the sector. So that's good news.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Box Bonus, brought to you in partnership with FT Longitude. We'll be back with a regular episode very soon. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen.